17 is supposed to be the age of reckless freedom, weekend football games, and the terrifying, thrilling weight of college applications. For me, 17 was the exact opposite. It was a masterclass in invisibility. It was learning how to sleep in the passenger seat of a rusted 1998 Ford Taurus without letting my knee hit the gear shift, pretending I didn't notice my mother softly crying in the driver's seat. My mother, Stella, and I had been evicted from our cramped apartment on the south side of Scranton, Pennsylvania, exactly 3 weeks after my birthday. Her hours at the local diner had been slashed by a new manager, and the crushing medical debt from my father's brief, brutal fight with pancreatic cancer had swallowed every dime we ever had. Our landlord, an unforgiving man named Gregory Hines, didn't care about our tragedy. He cared about the first of the month, and when we were 48 hours late on the rent, he changed the locks. We had nothing. The clothes in our duffel bags, a cooler of cheap deli meat, and my father's old acoustic guitar in the trunk. That was the sum total of our existence. I spent my days going to high school, showering in the boys' locker room before anyone else arrived, and my afternoons sweeping floors for under-the-table cash at a hardware store owned by an older guy named Frank Russo. Late October brought a bitter, bone-chilling freeze that the Ford's broken heater couldn't fight. One Tuesday night, the temperature plummeted to 19 degrees. My mother was shivering so violently her teeth chattered, clutching a thin, threadbare blanket around her shoulders. I knew if we stayed in the car, we might not wake up. Desperation makes you brave, but it also makes you observant. For weeks, I had been eyeing a property at the dead end of Elmira Street, right on the edge of town. It was a sprawling, skeletal Victorian house hidden behind overgrown weeping willows and a rusted wrought-iron fence. The locals called it the Harrow property. It had been completely abandoned since the late 90s. The roof sagged, the porch was rotting away, and the windows were boarded up with graying plywood. The neighborhood kids thought it was haunted. The city thought it was a toxic liability caught in a web of back taxes. I just thought it was a roof. Leaving my mother dozing fitfully in the car, I slipped through the broken iron gates and navigated the waist-high weeds. Armed with a crowbar I'd borrowed from Frank's hardware store, I wedged it behind a sheet of plywood on the back door. The wood groaned, protesting against the intrusion, before snapping off. I stepped inside. The air was heavy, smelling of dust, mildew, and decades of silence. I clicked on a small flashlight. Surprisingly, the bones of the house were solid. The water and power had been dead for a quarter-century, but it was dry. More importantly, it was entirely shielded from the biting wind. I ran back to the car, gently woke my mother, and told her I'd found a friend who was letting us crash in his basement. She was too exhausted and frozen to question the lie. When I guided her into the pitch-black parlor of the Harrow house, I laid down a tarp, piled up our sleeping bags, and held her until she stopped shivering. That was our first night. By day 4, the abandoned house had become our secret fortress. While my mother worked her shifts, I spent every free second making the place habitable. I cleared the debris from the central parlor, patched the broken windows with thick plastic sheeting, and brought in a battery-powered camp heater. It was illegal, dangerous, and terrifying, but for the first time in months, we weren't sleeping with one eye open, waiting for a cop to tap on the car window. But the Harrow property held secrets far deeper than just rotting floorboards. 2 weeks into our squatting, I was trying to pry up a warped floorboard in what used to be a ground floor study to use as firewood for the heavy cast-iron stove I'd managed to ventilate through the chimney. The wood cracked and split, revealing a hollow cavity between the joists. Inside, covered in a thick layer of cobwebs, was a heavy, olive green metal lockbox. My heart hammered against my ribs. I smashed the rusted padlock with my crowbar and pried the lid open. I didn't find gold or stacks of cash. Instead, I found dozens of leather-bound ledgers, a stack of legal documents, and a series of handwritten letters. The documents belonged to Silas Harrow, the original owner of the house, who had died in 1998. Reading through the faded ink by flashlight, a dark, twisted story began to unfold. Silas wasn't just a reclusive old man. He had been the chief accountant for Richard Sterling, the wealthiest real estate developer in Scranton, and currently the very man sitting on the city council pushing to demolish the Elmira Street neighborhood for a massive commercial complex. According to Silas's meticulous journals, Sterling had built his empire on a foundation of aggressive fraud, embezzlement from city funds, and illegal kickbacks. Silas had documented every stolen dollar, every bribed official, and every forged signature. The final journal entries were frantic. Silas wrote that Sterling had discovered he was keeping records. Silas was terrified for his life. 2 days after the final entry, Silas Harrow suffered a fatal heart attack, and Sterling bought off the local coroner to avoid an autopsy. Sterling had assumed Silas hid the ledgers in a safety deposit box that he couldn't access. He never imagined Silas had entombed them beneath the floorboards of his own decaying home. Sterling had purposefully let the Harrow property rot in legal limbo, using his influence on the city council to block the city from foreclosing on the tax-delinquent house, ensuring no one would ever buy it, renovate it, and find the evidence that could put him in federal prison. I was 17. I had $24 to my name, a dying Ford Taurus, and I was holding the keys to the destruction of the most powerful man in the city. The reality of my situation crashed down on me a week later. I was walking back from the hardware store when I saw a sleek, black SUV parked outside the rusted gates of Elmira Street. 2 men in suits were standing by the hood, pointing at the house. One of them was Richard Sterling. He looked older than his campaign billboards, his face flushed and aggressive. I ducked behind an oak tree, my blood turning to ice as I listened to their conversation. "I don't care about the environmental review," Sterling barked at the younger man, presumably his lawyer. "Push the demolition order through by Friday. The city is finally breathing down my neck about the blight. Tear it down to the foundation, dig it all up, and burn the debris. I want this eyesore gone." Panic seized my throat. My mother was inside. Our meager belongings were inside. And if they tore the house down, we would be back on the freezing streets if the demolition crew didn't crush us first. I couldn't run. I couldn't go to the police. Sterling owned half the precinct, and we were illegally trespassing. If I handed over the ledgers to a beat cop, they would disappear, and my mother and I would be arrested for squatting. I had to play the most dangerous game of chess imaginable, and I had to do it before Friday. The next morning, I skipped school. I went to the local public library and spent 4 hours researching property law, tax liens, and adverse possession. The Harrow house had exactly $43,112 in unpaid back taxes. Anyone who paid those taxes could initiate a process to claim the deed. But it took time. Time I didn't have. I needed leverage, fast, brutal leverage. I took 10 pages from Silas's ledger, the most damning pages detailing a $2.5 million embezzlement from the Scranton Public School Pension Fund, and made 3 separate photocopies at a local print shop. I put the originals back in the lockbox and buried it deep in the woods behind the property. At 4 p.m., I walked into the lobby of Sterling Enterprises downtown. The receptionist, a sharply dressed woman, eyed my scuffed sneakers and worn-out jacket with blatant disgust. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone dripping with condescension. "I need to see Richard Sterling," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Tell him I'm here about Silas Harrow's floorboards." The receptionist rolled her eyes but picked up the phone. 30 seconds later, the colour completely drained from her face. She hung up and silently pointed to the heavy oak doors at the end of the hall. Richard Sterling's office was a monument to wealth. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city he practically owned. He was pouring a glass of amber liquid from a crystal decanter when I walked in. He didn't look threatened. He looked annoyed. "I don't know what kind of prank you're pulling, kid," Sterling said, taking a sip of his drink. "But you have exactly 1 minute to explain yourself before I have my security team break your jaw and throw you in an alley." I didn't blink. I reached into my jacket, pulled out the manila envelope containing the photocopies, and tossed it onto his mahogany desk. "I live at 88 Elmira Street," I said, my voice eerily calm. "I know it's cold, so I started chopping up the floorboards for firewood. You'd be amazed what fits between the joists of a Victorian home. Lock boxes, for instance." Sterling sneered, opening the envelope. I watched his eyes scan the first page. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The arrogant slump of his shoulders vanished. His face went pale, then a violent, mottled red. His breathing hitched. He dropped the papers as if they were physically burning his hands. "Where are the originals?" he whispered, the hostility replaced by a raw, naked panic. "Buried," I lied smoothly. "And if I don't check in with a certain email server every 24 hours, an automated program will forward the entire ledger, plus Silas's letters detailing how you kept his heart medication from him, to the FBI field office in Philadelphia, the IRS, and the Scranton Times-Tribune." Sterling sank into his leather chair, staring at me as if a ghost had just walked into his office. "What do you want? Money? I can give you 50,000 cash right now. 100,000. "I don't want your dirty money," I said, stepping closer to the desk. "I want the house. The Harrow property. It's a toxic ruin. It's my home," I shot back, the anger I'd been suppressing for months finally bleeding through. "Here is what you are going to do, Mr. Sterling. You are going to go to the county clerk tomorrow morning. You are going to quietly pay the $43,112 in back taxes out of your own pocket. You are going to use your lawyers to clear the title and transfer the deed of 88 Elmira Street into a trust in my mother's name, Stella Miller. And then you are going to hire a private contractor to run legal electricity and water to the property by the end of the week." Sterling narrowed his eyes, the calculating predator returning. "And if I do this, you give me the ledgers?" "If you do this, I keep the ledgers exactly where they are," I corrected him. "Consider it my insurance policy. You leave my mother and me alone. You never come near Elmira Street again. If you try to hurt us, if you send someone to the house, or if I even see a city inspector looking at my property, the FBI gets the package." Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. The air hummed with the tension of a standoff between a multi-millionaire killer and a desperate 17-year-old boy who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Sterling looked at the photocopied pages on his desk, then back at me. He recognized the cold, dead look in my eyes. It was the look of someone who had hit rock bottom and survived. He knew I wasn't bluffing. "Fine," Sterling spat, his voice trembling with venom. "You'll have your deed by Thursday." "And the utilities," I reminded him, turning toward the door. "Make sure the heat works. My mum hates the cold." 4 days later, an unmarked van pulled up to the Harrow house. 2 men hooked up the municipal water line and activated the power grid. For the first time in 25 years, light spilled from the windows of 88 Elmira Street. That evening, I handed my mother a thick envelope. Inside was a certified deed to the property, legally registered to her name, completely free and clear of all liens. She sat on our makeshift bed in the parlor, staring at the document, tears streaming down her face. She asked me how I did it. I told her Frank Russo at the hardware store knew a guy looking for a massive tax write-off. She didn't need to know the truth. She didn't need to carry that darkness. It took 3 years to fully restore the house. I did the work myself, learning plumbing and carpentry from YouTube videos and Frank's advice. Richard Sterling never bothered us again. 2 years later, he was indicted on unrelated federal tax evasion charges and sentenced to 8 years in prison. I watched the news report from the warmth of my living room, the cast-iron stove glowing in the corner, feeling a profound sense of closure. At 17, I had been stripped of my dignity, my home, and my future. I was forced into the shadows, left to freeze in a forgotten car. But the world makes a fatal mistake when it pushes people into the dark. It forgets that in the dark, you learn how to see things that no one else can. I found a broken, abandoned shell that the world had discarded, and within its rotting walls, I found the power to rebuild my life. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was extortion, survival, and a refusal to be crushed. But as I sit here today, on the wraparound porch of 88 Elmira Street, listening to the wind rustle through the willow trees, I don't feel guilty. I just feel home,